Good afternoon, everyone. I warmly welcome you to this Accelerator session of the World Circular Economy Forum 2023 about steel decarbonization. I'm great to see you, so many of you here today. My name is Helena Kivi-Koskinen and I'm a steel and energy professional, and nowadays I work in a sustainability management consultant company called ACTS. And I'm also a board member of the Finnish Air Pollution Prevention Society. Welcome all. Today's event is organized by WWF Finland and co-funded by Outokumpu. WWF Finland is actively working for steel decarbonization. And Outokumpu in turn is committed to science-based targets and is a global leader in sustainable stainless steel. And why are we here today? We need to halt global warming under the 1.5 degree limit, and the green industrial transformation is urgently needed globally. Steel production is one of the biggest polluters in the world, as it's currently heavily relying on coal, fossil coal. Direct emissions from the steel industry must fall more than 90% by 2050 in comparison to 2021 to limit the temperature to 1.5 degree. And of course, the power production must decarbonize as well. The transformation must start today, since significant emission reductions must be reached already by 2030. Scrap in iron and steel industry play a major role. So the key questions for today are: how can the availability of scrap be secured in the future? What incentives are needed to promote circularity in the steel industry? Before we start our presentations, some housekeeping issues. About questions and answers, Q&A, you can ask questions after each keynote speaker. Simply raise your hand and we will bring you the mic here. Antti Jokinen there is the mic guy today, so please wait for the mic to arrive. And then additional comments or questions can also be used or written in the Mentimeter tool. I'll give you the instructions a bit later on. Those Mentimeter comments are very valuable for the WWF because they are definitely read afterwards and so on, if we are not able to take forward your questions aloud today. So please use the Mentimeter tool actively in order to get your message to World Wildlife Fund for this steel decarbonization project. And this event will be recorded and the materials will be there on the event page as well as the recording. And after this session, we are happy to ask you to stay a bit longer. Networking and mingling is very important in this kind of occasions. So please stay afterwards here in this room and the hall beside us. And if there are media, press influencers, we are happy to give any interview after the session. And social media. We are happy also if you are sharing your thoughts and impressing your comments in your own words. Here are the hashtags of our event, Role of Scrap, WCEF 2023, Green Steel, WWF Suomi, SBTi, Science-Based Targets meaning, and then Climate, Circular Economy, Nature. And please tag your post in LinkedIn, WWF Finland, and in Twitter, WWF Suomi. And the event page is WWF-FI hyphen steel. So this is the Mentimeter tool. You can try this QR code with your camera. However, you need to enter the code placed here, and this code will be replied after each session. And feel free to ask any questions and comments. So now are we about to start our program. First, I will introduce you Ville-Valtteri Visuri from the University of Oulu. He's an associate professor in the Process Metallurgy Research Unit at the university. He focuses on studying the chemical and physical fundamentals of steelmaking processes, especially electric arc furnaces, converters, and ladles. Visuri has a strong belief in the potential of modeling and simulation tools, which is a topic he also worked on at Outokumpu Stainless during his previous position as an R&D manager. Currently, he's eager to embark on research in the field of hydrogen plasma smelting reduction, a promising process that could significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the steel industry. Ville-Valtteri will tell us more about the future of scrap supply, global and regional perspectives. Ville-Valtteri, please, the floor is yours.
So thank you for this introduction. So with further ado, we can proceed to the topic at hand. So today we will have a small glimpse at the availability of scrap and some scenarios for global arena and also for Europe. Let's start off with the production of steel, which is of course the origin of scrap also. Probably most of you know that steel industry is something that used to be dominated by the Western countries, but nowadays China is producing more than half of the global steel production, and the consumption of steel is also not dispersed equally between countries, but we have quite different consumption figures for the West and for developing countries and for Asia. And I have cited here some figures that countries like South Korea consume quite a lot of steel, and they also import a lot of scrap for this reason. Then there are countries, let's say less developed countries, which use considerably less scrap, and the consumption of steel is probably going to increase mostly in these countries which have low figures at the moment. Then in order to establish where scrap is being consumed, we need to take a look at the different steel production routes, and we start off with the ore-based steel making, and this accounts for roughly 70% of the global production. The dominating process route for producing steel out of iron ore is this integrated route, where we produce the iron ore in the blast furnace using fossil reductants. We're talking about metallurgical coke. Then we remove this carbon using oxygen blowing, the basic oxygen furnace, and thereby induce quite a lot of CO2 emissions. Well, then the other major route is based entirely on scrap. We use electric arc furnaces to melt scrap and other materials to produce steel. Then we have a lot of other routes, but what is common to all these routes that it is not only the electric arc furnace route, but also these other routes which consume scrap to varying extent. So it is very important to keep in mind that electric arc furnace is not the only route consuming scrap. And we would be talking that in more detail in this slide. So we'll have a brief comparison between the electric arc furnace route and this integrated blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace route. So the electric arc furnace process is very versatile in the sense that it can be operated with up to 100% scrap. We can also use DRI, or direct reduced iron, or hot briquetted iron to supplement it, and this is very common. The steel plants based on electric arc furnaces are typically much smaller than those plants which are based on the integrated route. So this means that although they're using very high scrap shares, the absolute amount of scrap is not as enormous as you would think based on this. So this is something that I wish to highlight here, that also the integrated route uses scrap, and because the steel plants are typically much larger in size, they also are significant recyclers of steel. And there's some potential here. I've found this figure that 12.5% scrap would be used on average in the basic oxygen furnace, but I think this is a lowish figure, and I don't believe it myself. I think 20% would be closer to truth. But the technical limit would be around 30%, and using post-combustion technology, we could have even higher shares of scrap. So there's enormous potential to use scrap, more scrap in integrated routes. And here on the right, we see typical consumptions for these different routes, and we see that that in the blast furnace BOF route, we use quite a lot of coal and limestone. Also, the production of limestone induces CO2 emissions. And if we use more scrap, then we directly reduce these emissions and also the emissions related to the materials. Then we will be moving to the topic of scrap availability, having established this background where scrap is used. So we will be starting with global availability. The global availability is, of course, lacking behind the steel production, and this is because the typical lifetime of a steel product is relatively long, ranging from some years of consumer products to tens of years for buildings and construction materials. So this means that although we have seen this enormous rise in steel production in the last decades, nowadays we're producing about 1,800 million tons of steel per year, the amount of scrap available at the moment is lagging seriously behind. And I put here this kind of red line, which indicates like 50% of global steel production in 2022. So we see that we are like not really even there yet at the moment, but we will be catching up. So what this means in practice is that we will need to have also substantial iron ore-based production. The question is how to organize this in a way that doesn't produce as much CO2. Probably we could use hydrogen. And this is from a process technology point of view very interesting, because we will be using electric arc furnaces to melt this direct reduced iron. Then looking at the availability by region, the availability of scrap is not increasing everywhere at the same pace. We have much more scrap becoming available in the developing countries, and especially in China. And at the same time, the Chinese steel industry is using much less electric arc furnaces than the Western counterparts. So this means that there's a huge potential to increase the scrap use in China. And probably this could mean that investments take place in China to increase the production capacity using electric arc furnaces. Okay, then if we look at the Western countries here, more or less indicated with this EU plus NAFTA plus Japan, we see that there's some rise there, but nothing tremendous. So most of this increase in scrap will be in developing countries. Okay, and then availability in the EU. As mentioned already in this introduction, scrap is very important for the low CO2 strategy of the European Union. It's an easy way to reduce directly our CO2 emissions. And there are some projections for the availability of scrap in the EU. These scenarios have been published some years ago, so they are slightly out of date nowadays. But the point is that the availability of scrap is increasing in the EU to some extent, and I'm counting for all these different kinds of scrap types, not only this end-of-life scrap, but also internal uses and stuff like that. We could end up having 147 million tons by 2050. This would mean that we could produce much more than half of steel from scrap. In the meantime, the forecast for steel production in the EU is very stagnant. I would say this is a very optimistic scenario. I would say that it probably remains the same. So we have tremendous potential to cut our CO2 emissions in Europe by using more scrap, although the amount of scrap is not increasing that much as elsewhere. Then a few words about trade of ferrous scrap. I have this table which might be a bit difficult to read, but the point is that there you see the exporting regions and you see also destination regions, and we see that we have the total imports here on the right column, and here in the lowest row we have the net exports. So we can see which countries are actually net importers and which are net exporters. So the way to look at this graph is that the EU, US, and Japan, these industrialized countries, are the main net exporters of scrap. So actually we are exporting scrap, and some of the countries nearby EU importing more scrap are Turkey, for instance. Then we have large importers also in Asia, for instance, India and South Korea are very, very important in this area. So basically we could be using more of our own scrap that we are exporting at the moment. Of course, there are some technical challenges to exploiting more scrap, and this is where I come in. What I think typically how to use more scrap, this business side is not my cup of tea really. So of course there's this economic aspects like availability and price of scrap, what kind of scrap you could get for a certain price. Then a precondition that this makes sense to convert our production from integrated route to electric arc furnace route is that we get some kind of CO2 lean or even CO2 free electricity to melt this, because melting 1 ton of scrap is about 400 kilowatt hours. So it's a substantial amount of energy which is needed. And in the future there could be also possible export restrictions for scrap. Perhaps countries start putting barriers for exporting scrap, so this might also be a scenario. Then for the technical challenges that limit the use, of course, what kind of scrap we have in physical shape. If it's very small, it might be difficult to handle. If it's very large, you need to dismantle it. Then impurities are also something that are very detrimental for steel properties, and in this electric arc furnace route, we don't have that good possibilities to remove them as in the integrated route, which is more or less designed around removing impurities like phosphorus and carbon and sulfur. There are some specific elements which are quite a nuisance, especially copper, but for instance stainless steel making cobalt is also a nuisance. And okay, some of these can be removed, but species like copper can more or less be only diluted, so we cannot get rid of it, but we can just dilute it. Then there are radioactive substances which are how to say, a great pain in the ass in the steelwork because it's simply not allowed. Then you have variance of scrap properties. It's very difficult to control the electric arc furnace process if you don't know your inputs. And this is really the case that when we are trying to simulate the electric arc furnace process, we have a lot of unknowns. We don't really know what goes in, so it's relatively difficult to predict accurately what comes out. And this is something that we need to address using better scrap sorting, better analysis of scrap, and probably that then adds value also to the product when it's being sorted more better, let's say. Then of course in some countries, building up electric arc furnace capacity is also something that is not trivial matter. You need a lot of electricity. You cannot build it just anywhere. In developing countries, might be that you don't have an electricity grid that actually permits you to do these things. If we think of plaster, for instance, one key factor that was in favor of Finland in comparison to Norway was that the electricity grid in Finland is better suited for this kind of work than that of Norway. So to conclude, scrap plays a vital role. We will have more of it in the future, and this means that we have more potential to use it not only in the electric arc furnace route, but also in the integrated route. Probably we won't be getting rid of the integrated route in the next few years. And by 2050, the share of scrap-based steel making could rise to around 50% of total production. And finally, I wish to highlight that next week we have an event coming up. I'm organizing this electric arc furnace conference together with people from RWTH Aachen University, and we're happy to, well, registration is already closed, but it's good to know that we are having this kind of event where we are addressing these issues that I was talking about. Thank you.
So now it's your turn. Who would like to start with the first question?
Hello, Hayley Jarrett from the Supply Chain Sustainability School in Australia. I just have a quick question on the estimates that you put forward for the scrap availability in future years.
Yes.
Do they incorporate elements of reuse? So I know that if you're saying that if production comes forward about 50 years, do those estimates, are they possibly overestimated because of the reuse and design for disassembly that we've been hearing about higher up on that R ladder?
I think there are a lot of assumptions behind it. I think it's very difficult to say exactly what is the availability is. I think these are should be treated more or less as a trend and not as exact values. I think this kind of like consumer behavior for life and also design of equipment and infrastructure and stuff like that, of course, affects what is this cycle time during its use. So unfortunately, I don't know exactly the background of these calculations, that what kind of assumptions lie behind them. They have not been disclosed in detail.
Further questions? Please introduce yourself when asking questions. It's nice for everyone to know who you are, from which kind of a position. But now we have Rafal here.
Thank you very much. Rafal Malinowski, Systemiq. So I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the availability of iron ore, which seems to be a very big topic in the steel industry? That basically we won't have the proper enough of good quality iron ore to produce steel via DRI EAF route. So do you think it will be possible to solve part of that issue via better modeling and better sorting and sort of getting better at EAF technology? Or do you think that rather at some point, in example, melter BOF routes will take precedence over EAF and we will see less and less of EAFs being present?
I think that we are now probably too much thinking about getting rid of converters and all this infrastructure related to integrated route. I think if you are operating with very low quality ores, then having something else than electric arc furnace aside would be very beneficial. So I think I mean, how we used to think about this hybrid and this stuff is very good for our case, but I think there has not been that much talk about. I mean, these countries which have these poorer ores are also less enthusiastic about this idea anyhow. So it's like difficult to say, but I think they will need to address many issues that we don't have to do here.
Thank you.
Okay, there are some comments in the Mentimeter, Kirsi is telling me here, so let's check.
Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot answer that question. I don't know this. I mean, this calculation principle behind these projections was not disclosed. So I think this is something that should be improved in the future. That whenever people release estimates, they should also give how it's being calculated. This is something that makes it very difficult to assess the reliability of different predictions.
There's another question. Please, it would be interesting to hear who is talking.
Okay, my name is Ville-Valtteri Visuri and I'm from Kuusakoski, Oy. I have a question about you were talking about the sourcing of scrap, that how important it is, but how about, have you thought about the sourcing or how the alloying elements are available in the world for making steel?
Yes, that's of course an important question too. I think it's not like it's not, let's say if we think of the host of this event, Outokumpu, it's not probably coincidence that they invest in nickel mining capacity, so probably there will be then more competition about who gets these good ferroalloys or good alloying elements.
Thank you, Ville-Valtteri.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps we can address this topic later, because it's quite time-consuming to answer.
So, thank you. We will move forward to our next keynote speaker, who is Rafal Malinowski from Systemiq. Rafal Malinowski is an associate at Systemiq, focusing on decarbonization of heavy industries. He was the lead analyst in the Mission Possible Partnership Steel Sector Transition Strategy 2021, and he was also heavily involved in creation of the updated 2022 version, which aimed to outline a realistic technology pathway for the steel sector that would meet the 1.5 carbon budget. As a part of his work for the Energy Transition Commission and MPP, he also co-created the draft Steel Science-Based Target Settings Guidance that went into public in last November, as well as supported the SBTi this year in incorporating the consultation feedback. Before Systemiq, Rafal worked for 4 years at McKinsey Company and holds a degree in chemical engineering. Rafal will now tell us more about how the scrap-based steel production is treated in the new SBTi 1.5 steel sector guidance that will be published soon. Rafal, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Rafal, and I am from a company called Systemiq, which is a B Corp that aims to speed up our transition to net zero nature positive economy, and we progress our goal across five main platforms or sectors of life, which is nature, energy, materials, finance, and also urban development. And we further this goal in multiple ways, so via published research and analysis, and also we try to generally join the trend of making a lot of our assumptions and models open source, so we can have very informed discussions about them. We also built various coalitions of ambitious companies and organizations to basically band them together and try to do something together to further the goal. And also, we take part in investments into various startups that can help the transition, and sometimes we take direct action. So you can see with a green border here, Energy Transitions Commission, which is one of our coalitions, and through that we have been approached by SBTi to help them update their steel sector guidance on target setting to basically make it 1.5 degree aligned and clear some of the issues surrounding it. So since I was the lead from Systemiq side, I was asked by the organizers to shed a bit of light on how we treat scrap in this guidance. So first we'll speak a little bit about the challenges that we faced when setting the guidance. Then we will speak a little bit about the scrap and how it is what is scrap in the steel system. And then we'll speak how some of these challenges were fixed, or maybe not fixed, but tackled in the steel guidance. So what are the challenges? So first of all, ore-based and scrap-based production have vastly different carbon footprint, and yet there is almost perfect overlap between their products. So they can make essentially the same products. Like for scrap, sometimes it is much more hurdle, but it can be done. But also, scrap is finite, and there is simply not enough of it to cover the whole steel demand. And as we have seen, maybe not have seen yet, but so the distribution of steel production around the world is not equal, and thus access to scrap is not equal. And yet, while crafting our guidance, we had to ensure that this guidance is fair and works for every company, regardless of its location or asset composition. So before we dive into the topic, very small disclaimer from me that SBTi is still working on the guidance, and since they are the heart, brain, and owners of the guidance, and they have all the right to change it still. So please do not misconstrue this presentation as official SBTi communication, because it's not. It's just about our recommendations to the SBTi. So without further ado, let's move on to the scrap and how it's like what's the scrap's role in the steel system. So this is grossly oversimplified production pathway, or like outline of how steel is made today. So we can see that there are two main processes. There is ore-based production and there is scrap-based production. And the main difference between them is the iron making step. So iron is the main element, the main material that is used for steel production. And the pity is that it is hidden in iron ore. And iron ore is pretty stable material, like it survived for millions of years, and it's quite difficult to rip out iron out of it. So in order to do that, we have to provide chemical agents such as coal or natural gas or other forms of carbon or hydrogen, and iron ore, and we have to react them together in very harsh conditions. So we are speaking about temperatures reaching up to 2,000 degrees in order to strip the oxygen out of iron ore and get molten metal. And this molten metal flows then into the steel making step. And at that stage, it gets so hot in the ore-based production that we actually have to add a little bit of scrap to cool it down. So this ore-based production route is not 100% ore-based. If we look at the bottom, the scrap-based route is simpler or it is shorter in a sense that we start from scrap. The main input is scrap, and we can run it up to 100% scrap, no issues. But in reality, very often ore-based inputs are also used in the scrap-based production route. So it is not 100% scrap-based either. So the need to process iron ore results in ore-based production being few times more energy and emission intense than scrap-based production. So because of the high energy intensity of this reaction of iron ore, like this need for energy is today met with coal and basically that converts into very high emission intensity. And if we also take a look at these investment needs required to basically change these assets, to decarbonize these assets, to change them to build these assets, we can see that the investment needs required for iron making steps in the ore-based production inflate the investment costs required to change them, right? So we are speaking like these assets, these ore-based assets are bigger, they cost more because they have more steps, and they have much higher requirement for renewable energy outside the steel plant. The situation is much different for scrap-based production because majority of carbon footprint of scrap-based production sits in power provision. So if I operate electric arc furnace and I replace my power supply with renewables, I am mostly there. And ore-based assets have to do even more of that, and also they have to bear the cost of ripping out their current assets and replacing them with new assets. So to sum up, we can't really expect ore-based assets to move to decarbonize as fast as scrap-based assets. We can ask a question here. Do we care, right? I mean, like if you can't, if it's so difficult to tackle emissions of ore-based production, maybe we should just get rid of it and replace it with scrap. So let's assess that statement a little bit. And as we have already heard, steel is made to be used. So, and thus scrap or waste steel comes out of steel in use. So here at this slide, you can see on the y-axis, you can see the very interesting metric of steel stock per capita. So steel in use, steel stock per capita for various regions around the world. And on the x-axis, you can see cumulative emissions per capita. So these are historical cumulative emissions per capita. So how many emissions had to be emitted into the atmosphere for the current population of these regions to enjoy the steel stock? And we can see that in the sort of central part of the graph and also to the right, we have our traditional industrialized regions, industrialized economies, USA, Europe, we have Japan, which coincides with what we heard just a little bit before, that these regions are tend to be main exporters of scrap steel. Well, of course, because in the past, they had to, because they already built the stock that they needed. And the issue here is that these regions did not have steel stock to tap into to get scrap and recycled steel, or at least not that much of it. So they had to go via ore-based routes to produce the stock that we have today. And we can see that, of course, it's one of the drivers, but we can see it in cumulative emissions per capita. So we have to keep in mind that, like maybe to put it in poetic terms, that the good deed of steel recycling was made possible only by the original sin of ore-based production. And the bigger the sin in the past, the easier it is now to recycle. And if we now go to the bottom left of the chart, we can see that we can see billions of people who are still in the process of building their steel stock. And we are not speaking luxury cars here. We are speaking, bridges, pipes bringing in water. We are speaking safe buildings made out of reinforced concrete. So we can't really expect these people to just sort of to just not do it, right? Because we are speaking about basic joys of modern life. And yeah, so let's move on. Oh, sorry. So as we have seen also in the previous presentation, there is not likely by 2050, when we are supposed to be at net zero emissions, there is likely not going to be enough scrap to cover the whole demand. So when we have that scrap, what is the best way to allocate it? So let's say that we live in a situation where we produce 100 tons of steel per year. And you can see on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you can see the production capacity of that production that we have. It roughly coincides with what we have today. And on the y-axis, you can see the emission intensity of that production. And now we know, let's say that we know that the demand for steel is going to increase by 10 tons, and also the scrap availability is going to increase by 10 tons, or like enough to meet that increasing demand. And we have essentially two ways to go about it. We can give that scrap to least emission scrap recyclers. And so basically we take that green bar and make it wider so that they cover more production, and they bring the average emission intensity down. The other way is to give it actually to the dirtiest producers, or maybe not the dirtiest, but the most emission intense producers. And so that would to allow them to not make iron, right? Because the iron making is the most emission intense process. So by giving them scrap, we make them not do it, which also brings emission intensity down. And we can see that the impact is roughly comparable. So these are two viable pathways to allocate the scrap in an efficient manner. And why is this important? Why is this important? Because when we crafted the guidance, we thought that we are actually steering the scrap in one way or the other. And we feared that we may push the world into a situation where least emission plants, which are typically generally located in industrialized countries with better access to capital, with better access to scrap, and so on, that we will give them credits for simply buying up more scrap, which is a finite resource. And yeah, like that struck us as a bit unfair. But to sum up some of the arguments, scrap comes mostly out of the accumulated steel stock. Steel stock has accumulated in countries with largest historical emissions per capita. And this stock had to be made via ore-based steelmaking. And countries with highest steel stock per capita are home to some of the most least emission-intense plants, and these plants also enjoy better physical and legal infrastructure to decarbonize. So how did we tackle these issues? First of all, we split the reference pathways based on IEA net zero emissions scenario into two reference pathways. So there is scrap-based at the bottom, like hypothetical 100% scrap-based pathway, and at the top there is hypothetical 100% ore-based pathway. And since companies typically blend these two, the shape of the trajectories, the shape of trajectory for a given company is going to be a blend of these two. And now we make a very big decision. We basically say that scrap is global common good. And because it's common global good, the benefit of it is should be spread across the whole industry. And the way we structure it is that scrap-based pathway is set. Like we set it in such a way that that under baseline conditions, it's easier for scrap-based producers to meet their target than for ore-based producers. But then we make the ore-based pathway dependent on the availability of scrap. So if we push the scrap availability further, you have the red line, which is the reference that we have seen a little bit before on the previous slide. And now we bump the availability of scrap in the system. And then we bump it again. And you can see that the target, the intensity target implied by 2030 changes from 29% to 16% because there is simply more scrap available in the system. And its benefit is suddenly spread across all the steel production, all the ore-based steel production, irrespective of where you are, like what do you produce, and what's your and whether you know about SBTi or not. And because the benefit of scrap is spread across all the production, the whole industry, there is one important nuance here. And this nuance is that when we look at the single company pathway, it looks a bit unintuitive because we have two situations here. So we have one single ore-based producer that in the green scenario, it doesn't change its scrap ratio. It doesn't change its scrap use over the period of the target. And in the next scenario, it changes suddenly, switches to 50% scrap-based production. And we can see that the target drops suddenly. Why? Because this producer suddenly taps into the global common pool of scrap, and immediately, because of that, lowers its emissions. But we also have to recognize that if I use more scrap, that means that someone else can't use it. And because this benefit has been already accounted for in the green light, we have to adjust it, because otherwise we'll be double counting the benefit of scrap. First at the global level, and then second at the single company level. So we treat scrap as common global pool good. So if its availability increases, the budget available for ore-based production increases. And because of that, we also have to adjust the target. We have to adjust the target. And also what is important, that emission intensity target does not change with increased availability of scrap, but under baseline conditions, it is more lenient than for ore-based producers. So we believe that this kind of arrangement, ensures, like incentivizes companies and governments to cooperate at the global level to increase scrap availability and scrap use. And we fear that other arrangements would actually make them hoard the scrap for their own use. And we believe that that would benefit the few and hurt us all. Thank you very much. Sorry for the time.
I really find that interesting, what you were explaining. So do you agree on that kind of a method? Does somebody disagree? What are your comments? Please, it was so interesting.
So hello, my name is Eero Oksanen from Foras. And as nobody was putting the hand up, I'm always curious. So I'm wondering here that when we compare this kind of like a new steel production and the recycled steel production, then in the future still the steel production is going up. And especially with the green revolution we are now facing, and our company, for instance, building massive solar plants, in the future, the steel production goes up, and then we have this finite resource of the scrap. So my question here is that in the future, steel is eternal, in a sense. Mm-hmm. So if the amount of steel used in a society would not grow, although it does, could we end up in the future in a situation that we can use 100% scrap? Or is it that, the steel anyhow, it breaks down from the ships and so forth. So anyhow, like there's even like a theoretical maximum of the recycled steel, although the need of cumulative steel in society would not grow. Yep. And what is this kind of theoretical max of how much the scrap and recycled material could be of the whole material in total?
I think that's a great question, but I believe colleagues here would be better suited to answer some of them. But the way I see it is that there is a theoretical maximum, but it's not that much of a maximum, in the sense that there are some contaminants, like copper and other elements mentioned in the previous presentation. And if we recycle the same stock of scrap over and over and over again, we end up with accumulation of these elements. So at some point, we are going to hit a situation where I would like to make this high-grade, high-quality, flat sheet for my car, but the steel is too contaminated for me to do it. So what I have to do? Well, I have to add a little bit of fresh iron to dilute it, to basically bring back the composition to the required specs. So, but of course, in time, we are going to get better at managing these elements. So I wouldn't be surprised if we are going to push and push and push that boundary with time. So I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with something close to 100%, maybe in like 60 years from now. Why not? I'm quite sure we can end up there.
Thank you, Rafal.
Thank you much.
Please make your comments or questions into the Mentimeter tool. I'm sure that all the speakers are willing to, even later, to reply on them. It's possible in there once you have the code and so on. But now we will move forward. The next guest speaker will be Tuomas Haikka from Kuusakoski. He's working as a Chief Sustainability Officer. He's a visionary, ambitious business and people leader with 20 years of experience in global manufacturing industries. He has a strong track record in building commercial success, growth and competitive edge through sustainable value chains. Tuomas also serves as a chairman of the board for the recycling industries in Finland. As a Chief Sustainability Officer of Kuusakoski, which is Northern Europe's leading industrial recycling company, Tuomas will describe the recycler's role when overcoming the scarcity and quality challenges in steel value chains. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Helena. Yes, thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for the organizing committee and also thank you, audience. It's very exciting and interesting topic to be discussed. Today, hopefully, I can relate a little bit to the practical how we recycle and give you a little bit introduction to the fantastically interesting world of recyclers. As said, I work for company Kuusakoski. I will not go through in detail too much, but maybe the one topic I would like to highlight that the company is close to 110 years old, and the business has always been around circularity and recycling. We handle roughly 1 million tons of material annually, and vast majority is metals, and let's say 600,000 tons steel, iron and steel. As said, we've been speaking here a little bit about the alloying elements and the other metals too, so we really focus on the metals, and of course today we will be mostly speaking about iron and steel and then stainless steel. But okay, if we a little bit set the background regarding the steel recycling, we all know that we speak about the green transition and the need of circularity and the metals is tremendous. And as we know, when we go towards this transition, we need to build the public infra or rebuild it, and there we need tremendously steel. Today, steel is already kind of the most recycled industrial material. And if I think last year we produced roughly 600 million tons recycled-based steel, and that avoided roughly 1 billion tons of emissions. We have heard excellent background today about the stocks and projections. I think 600,000 is not enough, and in future we will have a, let's say, tremendous need for recycling going forward. And I think also philosophically, obviously, once made steel, it needs to be recycled, and it's kind of the logical way and most preferred option going forward. And perhaps just to recapitulate one topic, obviously metals are alloys or elements. They will not wear down when we recycle. So in theory, they are recyclable forever. And when we see this, obviously the first conclusion is that once they are capable of bringing multiple life cycles, it's absolutely important to kind of capitalize on this quality and make sure that we recycle as much as possible and as effectively as possible. Then how does it cumulate? When we cumulate life cycles going forward, little bit how much we lose on every life cycle, that accumulates. So if we think about the fact that we have a material that has an overall recycling rate of 80%, going towards the infinity, it will lead into, let's say, five full life cycles, or 5 times the initial material. And if we then look up around steel's numbers, let's say between 94 and 97%, we see that this gap makes a huge difference in the life cycles that you can cumulatively, in theory, see. And that's really one of the key points in our business and how we like to take forward the business. So try to maximize the life cycle of once made steel and make the recycling industry or recycling process as efficient as we can. Then perhaps just very shortly recapitulate what will happen. Today we have heard really from various sources that it's really 30 to 70% of the initial new steel being produced, so that 30% is based on recycling. And then we have a use phase, and at the end of the use phase we have a steel coming at the end of the use phase, and then we could speak a little bit about the recovery rate, how efficiently we get the steel into the recycling system after the use phase. And let's say it's around 95% today. And then we enter the recycling process, so to speak. So recycled steel after the use phase, it's very efficiently recycled today, but still we are not at the 100%. So I would say we are today somewhere between 98 and 99%. And then we come into the creating and recycling of the steel, so it's not fully used, or you don't achieve 100% either in when you produce new steel. So overall, I would say that the recycling efficiency is around 90% for the steel. And then what are we as a recycling industry? We are trying to do very much, and we at the company every day, we are trying to improve the phases of 2, 3, and 4. And how do we practically go on and do this? Little bit the background, as it was really, we had a questions today. The steel's life cycle is on average 40 years. So if we don't calculate in the new or prompt or home scrap, the end of the life steel that we receive today in recycling, or the material that we face, typically it's from 70s, 80s, or 90s. And when I look to amounts, let's say 600 to 750 millions annually, that's roughly the amount that we get from the society today. Obviously, there is material that has a shorter lifespan, and then there are material that has a significantly longer lifespan. So this being said, the conclusion is a little bit the same than the previous talk was that yes, we will face a scarcity of recycled steel, let's say at least few decades going forward. And it's really kind of underlined by the fact that steel actually has very long and efficient life cycle. So it would be a little bit complex or paradox to try to shorten the life cycle in order to get more steel into recycling loop in that sense. But good, then the other challenge, also we've been touched a little bit today, these materials are valuable, solutions will become more complex. All the producers of very valuable metal materials, they also like to save materials in their production. So from recycles point of view, all the materials that we receive, typically they are becoming more and more complex. The material composition is more and more fragmented. So if we today get car from 2000, 2005, which is typically the age when it's, let's say, scrapped, it's becoming in the future much more challenging to achieve even the level of recovery for the metals that we have today. And this is basically something that enforces the recycling industry all the time, develop more efficient solutions and then try to improve our processes in that way that we would try to be able to have even higher recycling rate than what we have here. And when we count in this complexity, obviously that's a little bit challenge going forward. And then the second challenge is our customers, steel industry, other base metals producers, they want to have more pure materials going forward. So it's a little bit the quantity and the quality. So what we can really do in order to make this, let's say, life cycle more efficient and increase the level of recycling in the industry. Obviously, we can try to improve the recovery rate. We can build in the best-in-class capacity in order to get the materials separated. And one thing, obviously, that we need to maximize the life cycle together with our customers and also from the recovery side. And in order to us really tailor the material for our customer, that's really key to the success. And then obviously our customers require a lot of new information. So recyclers today, they are coming a little bit like the information pool also, because we need to produce information about our bits and pieces in the value chain, so carbon footprints, etc. So I don't go obviously do the industrial integrated recycling process. I just say that today the recycling process is also kind of facing the challenge, and we are all the time doing new investments, whether it's pre-treatment, whether it's investing the overall recycling capacity, whether it's investing into the latter part of this integrated recycling process, so that we would get even the final halves of % from difficult materials back into the cycle in order to make the overall life cycle more efficient. And just very shortly, in case of stainless steel, there is few grades of steel which are different. And for this example also, there are elements which in one grade they might be wanted element, and in the other grade they might be impurity or something that we don't want. And again here, together improving the process and having together a little bit cooperation, we can improve that. And if I very shortly also comment in the wider scope, what can we do in order to boost the recycling or circularity? We obviously know we need to have an efficient recovery, and from our industry point of view, anything we can do to improve the efficiency of end-of-life recycling, that's excellent and absolutely needed. Then circular economy. Today, European Union has a Critical Raw Materials Act. USA, they have this Inflation Reduction Act. Those are both policies that will really aim to secure the investments and improve the, let's say, homeland raw material safety and availability. This type of a thing best is that we get a good playing field that will make it possible to have a good investments in Europe. And obviously should remove all the obstacles between the recycling, so free trade and sustainable trade. Then obviously we could have incentives in form of carbon credits for recycling, or maybe set the targets for recycled content. So rather have a carrot that will incentivize the industry to go forward with. And I also personally, I would like to have a more economical incentives than then the value chain or industry will follow. And then finally, I think promoting the eco-design, because what we see when we receive the material that today, it's very illustrative sentence here. New products should be designed for recycling, because today we design the recycling process for the materials. And then this is really our common topic. And then maybe at the end of the day also recycling creates a little bit emissions, and that's something that we want to make our our part of the value chain completely carbon-free, and therefore we have set targets and timeline and carbon pathway when we will do it. And our first kind of a concrete step is that we have just launched 100% carbon-free recycling facility in northern Finland, obviously close to our customers. Again, this facility enables us to have a better recycling rates, better recovery rates, and completely decarbonize the, let's say, steel recycling impact or the climate impact for the materials that we will treat in this facility. So I think that time is up. Thank you. That was more or less what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuomas. What about you? Who would like to ask questions? Here, Rafal.
Thank you. I want to ask one question, maybe like just to pick your brain. If you would have the power to introduce one legislation globally to, basically solve everything, or like generally like push the recycling as much as possible, what would it be? Like what is the main blocker, you would say?
Well, as it was in the presentation, I think currently we have the capacities are matching quite well on the material that we get for the recycling. But obviously, personally, I'm very much in favor for economical incentives and kind of the free markets to take care of it. So I'm firm believer in that. So economically, make it preferred option to base on recycling.
Thank you. Thank you, Tuomas.
Thank you.
There is one question in the Mentimeter. Could we have that one? Oh, sorry, not the Mentimeter. We have another question here, a live question.
Don't freak out, it's the same question. I put it in the Mentimeter. Just to elaborate on it though, so I suppose my question was around, there's a lot of social challenges with scrap around the world. So we're starting to see the scarcity of it, because it is a finite resource, is starting to cause like piracy of ships being broken down to then be used as scrap. There's also, because of the lack of it, we've seen it even with other minerals, there's a lot of illegal behaviour going on in order to source it because it has such a high economic value. There's also a lot of impetus on organisations in many countries to eradicate modern slavery from their supply chains. So they're looking for more trackability and traceability of those materials and raw ingredients into their production facilities to ensure that there's no slavery or adverse human rights impacts through those supply chains, which is driving increased transparency. And we're all constantly hearing that the scrap supply chain, it's impossible to be able to trace where some of this material comes from. So my question is, how do we improve the traceability and trackability of where the scrap's coming through so that we can ensure that they're still being produced as responsible, not just low carbon?
Yes, thank you. That was a very good question. I think we are much more mature level in European Union regarding this level. And obviously the Recycling of Steel Act, so to speak, we need to be aware where we collect it, where is it processed, and today you need basically to fully track it already. For example, our customers, they ask where it has been collected, can you secure that it has been collected under the, let's say, ethically sound conditions. And this is really one of the topics that, again, it needs to be steered from the demand side. So obviously we need to tackle this problem and make sure that throughout the value chain or supply chain we require that this information is available and the material is in that sense traceable.
Thank you, Tuomas.
Thank you.
We will now move forward. Our next keynote speaker is present here in this room virtually, and I will come here so she's able to see me. Do you hear me, Pippa? Do you see me, Pippa? Yes. Hello, Pippa. Can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, and now I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
So our next keynote speaker will be Dr. Philippa Horton from the University of Cambridge. She's trained as an automotive design engineer and following a PhD on material efficiency in automotive production. She joined the University of Cambridge as a business manager in 2019. Pippa acts as the bridge between research and the key industrial sectors with a particular focus on steel and cement. She oversees delivery and implementation of research, coordinating relationships with industry partners and managing industrial deployment of demand reduction and technology innovation. She has initiated 3 spin-out companies called Structural Panda, which is an early-stage structural design software for reducing embodied emissions in buildings, and then Deep Form, which is a method for automotive metal forming with less production loss, and last but not least, Cambridge Electric Cement, which is a symbiotic process of recycling cement in an electric arc furnace. Pippa will tell us now more about the importance of high-value recycling for steel and from academic perspective. Pippa, please, the floor is yours. It will be video this time for certainty of technology things.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm sorry that I'm not there in person, so thank you for bearing with me for a virtual presentation. I'm Dr. Philippa Horton. I have a PhD in material efficiency for the automotive sector, and I now work as a business manager at the University of Cambridge. And my role looks to implement the research that we undertake at the university in practice. Today I'm going to talk about high-value recycling, specifically from the perspective of material efficiency. I'm going to start with my final slide so you know exactly what's coming up in this talk. We talk about climate change as a climate emergency, and the word emergency is really important. We're not just creating strategies for the future of steel and long-term thinking. We need to be thinking about what we can do today to act now. So there are 3 messages I'd like you to take away from my talk today. These are to maximize material efficiency, so to use less steel, to maintain the value of the steel that we have, so by avoiding downcycling, and to create mechanisms so that we can have fair access to the steel that's available. And although the talk is focused on high-value recycling, all of these ambitions are linked. So in order to create a just transition, we need to maximize material efficiency. And if we do that, we need to avoid downcycling. I haven't told you anything new. This is old new. We've known these statements for a long time: reduce, reuse, recycle. But these priorities are often overshadowed by a 4th message. And this is the decarbonisation of primary production. And that is really important, but we don't have the luxury of just choosing one strategy. We need to do both. We need to decarbonise primary production, but we also need to do material efficiency. When we talk about material efficiency, it's rooted in the concept of not having enough steel, which is why we need to use it more wisely. And although reduce is really well understood as a strategy to reduce emissions, thinking of steel as a scarce resource is quite frightening. Shortage of steel wouldn't just prevent us buying a new car. It would affect the growth of infrastructure and developing economies which are needed for a just transition, and it would inhibit the deployment of essential zero-emission technology. And because it's so frightening, we tend not to think about it. Instead, we put all our efforts into growing primary production to ensure these shortages don't happen. But is this okay? Or are we just burying our heads in the sand and hoping that we don't need material efficiency because it's really frightening? If there is a chance we might not have enough green steel to support the growth that we need, do we need a plan B? So let's have a look at these risks. If there is a chance that zero emission steel production won't grow fast enough to meet our needs, we'll need a plan B. There are two main types of constraints that worry me about the rate in which the supply of green steel will grow. First, the availability of scrap for recycled steel production. Scrap available is growing as the investments that we made in the 80s are returning back into the supply chain. But we don't have enough scrap in the market to meet this increasing demand for green steel. The scrap is also in the wrong place and it's downcycled, making it less useful. Second is the availability of zero emission primary steel. This constraint isn't considered as much as scrap because it's a bit less visible. Making steel without emissions requires a huge amount of clean energy or clean hydrogen and the infrastructure to connect these energy inputs into the steel production facility. And you do hear of projects which are being cancelled or delayed because this grid connection or the energy resource is costly or not currently available. Globally, we have targets of 2050 for zero emissions, but many organisations are setting more ambitious targets, hoping to decarbonise their products by the late 2030s and 2040s, and this will require a lot of green steel. In analysis undertaken at the University of Cambridge, we considered the physical constraints of low emission steel production, and we estimated that by 2050 we could produce a maximum of 1.6 gigatons of green steel. And this is much less than the 2.5 gigatons that we are likely to need with the current forecast of growth strategies. And I hope that we can overcome these physical constraints on green steel production. And that's thinking about how much the scrap availability is there and the quality of the scrap, but also the energy and the infrastructure that supports primary production. But these risks do exist. And if there's a shortage of supply, it's the people which need it most who will suffer. The stakes are so high, I think we do need a plan B, just in case we don't have enough green steel to meet the demand. So what is plan B? In case you missed it on the previous slide, plan B is material efficiency. And this is where the doom and gloom bit of my talk ends. There are huge opportunities for material efficiency. We can do something about this. From reducing scrap in car production to designing buildings more efficiently so they require half the material, we can design products more efficiently and we can use them for longer. There are immense opportunities for material efficiency. But this talk is on high-value recycling, right? So I bet you're thinking, why do we keep talking about material efficiency? How does it fit in? The point is that in a scenario which has high levels of material efficiency, we have to stop downcycling. So therefore, we need high-value recycling. So now let's talk about recycling. Material efficiency strategies are included in roadmaps, such as the IEA's Iron and Steel Roadmap shown here. This graph is taken from their report. It shows that material efficiency interventions can reduce the demand for steel to about 1.8 gigatons per year. And this is much closer to the 1.6 gigaton figure I presented before. So let's assume we've followed this roadmap. We've been really successful at reducing our demand for steel, and we put the policies and mechanisms in place to reduce our demand for steel by, say, 20%. We now design and use steel so efficiently that we have enough zero-emission supply available. What does that mean? It means we recycle all of our scrap into secondary steel, and this makes up about half of our total steel supply. But there's a problem with this. The steel we recycle usually ends up as downcycled, as rebar, and we don't need that much rebar. Let me show you. This graph shows the steel supply chain with the colour representing the estimated copper concentration. So blue has a low copper and orange has high copper. Let's take the example of a car and follow it through the system. Primary steel is used to make the car, and this is shown with this blue line, which has a low copper content. At the end of life, this steel is recycled and mixed with other low-grade steels and other contaminants, such as copper. We now have a steel which has too much copper to be used to make a car, so we use it for a reinforcing bar in construction. And this is fine at the moment because we have plenty of demand for rebar. But remember, in 2050, I previously estimated that about half of our steel supply will come from scrap, and we don't need that much rebar. This bar chart on the left shows how we use steel today. And if we look in the middle column, we can split this up by the type of steel produced. The yellow, orange and red sections make up more than half of the total demand, and these would all require high-value recycling in order to remove copper content from the scrap steel if they were going to be produced from secondary sources. If high-value recycling techniques are not in place, we would have a really inflexible system, and we would have to use primary steel to make these kind of products, so sheets and tubes. Therefore, we would have to use the secondary steel for low-quality products such as sections and rebar. Otherwise, we would have excess scrap but shortages in total supply. And that would be a really inflexible system. This next graph shows that by 2050, we'll have more low-quality scrap than we need. And this is a global average. Developed economies have already reached this threshold where they have more scrap than they require. It will be sooner if material efficiency is achieved, as the demand for construction steel could be reduced by 50% through better design optimization. So we need high-value recycling. High-value recycling would enable long-term steel circularity so that we could continue to have a circular economy in steel beyond 2050. It would enable immediate direct reduction of emissions because we could start to use secondary steel for high-value steel products, such as cars. It would de-risk decarbonisation plans for primary steel users. For example, if a car maker is looking at using hydrogen steel for their future product, but it doesn't come online in time, they might end up using a natural gas DRI, which would produce emissions. But if we have high-value recycling in place, then they could, as a backup, use recycling instead. High-value recycling also enables a higher implementation of material efficiency on a global scale. It creates competition for scrap, and it would create more opportunity to use that secondary steel wisely. It would also create a much fairer and flexible steel market because any product could be made through multiple manufacturing routes. And this is really important for a just transition because it gives flexibility in the system. We know this, the IEA states it, but so far investment and motivation for high-value recycling and material efficiency are vastly overshadowed by the need to decarbonise primary production incentives. But how is that fair, I hear you ask? A just transition requires economic growth, and economic growth requires a lot of steel, and in regions that don't have much scrap. So is it fair for us to use scrap to make cars, and would that deprive growing economies of scrap for, say, infrastructure and buildings that they need for this just transition? This is really important. We must support fair access to steel and enable our sustainable development goals to be met. This is true if we have an abundant supply of zero-emission primary steel, but that might not be the case if we don't have enough primary steel, and zero-emission steel is not abundantly available due to constraints in energy availability or build delays in these facilities. The only way to ensure a fair transition is to heavily implement material efficiency so that we don't need to make as much steel, and that will ensure that there is enough supply available for everybody. And if we do that, we need high-value recycling so that we can make all of our products, not just the low-value ones. Disincentivizing high-value recycling in order to protect scrap steel supplies for developing regions doesn't solve the problem of steel shortages. If we don't have enough steel available due to constraints in the primary production of zero-emission steel, downcycling will just create an inflexible system in which some regions will only be able to produce low-quality steel products because they don't have access to the energy infrastructure required for zero-emission primary production. Instead, fair access to scrap steel could be created by using much less steel through material efficiency. This would enable excess steel supply, both primary and secondary, to be used in regions which don't have sufficient scrap availability. This challenge of having too much low quality scrap I showed on the graph earlier is estimated to take place at 2050, which is a long way off. So why do we need to solve this problem now? As I said at the start of my talk, it's an emergency, a climate emergency, so we have to act now. We can't just wait until 2050 in order to start to take action, hoping that everything will be okay. It takes time to implement these industry changes. We need to mature and be developed by 2050. We can't wait until we've got piles of rebar in landfill because there's no use for it in order to implement high-value recycling. Emissions. If there are delays to zero-emission primary production, some applications will be forced to use high-emitting steel for longer. So access to high-valued recycled products can prevent this from happening. Motivation. Consumers are motivated to reduce emissions already. They are setting ambitious targets and the market is being disrupted with new business models. We can make the most of this and make a change for the long-term sustainable option of recycling. Knowledge. We can act now. There is sufficient technology. We understand how to do better sorting. We know how to do high-quality recycling. We just need a market which incentivizes it and enables it to grow and thrive. So I'd like to close with the 3 messages from the start of my talk. Currently, most of our effort is focusing on decarbonising primary steel production, and this does make sense, but we mustn't let this overshadow the really difficult but essential objectives of maximising material efficiency, maintaining the value of our steel by avoiding downcycling, and creating mechanisms to promote fair access to steel. If we do the first 3, it makes the task much easier for number 4 as we reduce the demand we require to manufacture. Thank you so much for listening to my keynote talk today. I'm really happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Pippa. Thank you so much for this very important perspective, just transition. I hope that that makes you think about how important this will be. Who would like to start? Shall we use the Mentimeter? Is it easier? Oh, sorry, I did not. You were too close to me. To me. I did not see your hand.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
I was again the spare man here to ask. So, so thank you for a good presentation. I'm just wondering here that as a society gets richer, it's kind of logical that we would use more steel because that's kind of the measure of welfare in a sense. And I must say that I'm totally pro the environment, but I'm just asking that would it in some cases be more sensible to use a lot more steel, for instance, that the water systems that we have under cities are made from concrete or plastic or some other things. What if we use stainless steel for those? So I'm wondering that in what sense, beyond the being efficient, in some sense it would make more sense in terms of the environment or welfare of the humans to use more steel, and how big is this difference? And so my name was Erkkilä.
Hi, thank you. Really, really good question. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, that's good. So really good question. So there are occasions where it might be better to use more steel instead of other materials or other products. And there has to be a kind of sensible system level discussion to say when you might have some increase in steel demand in order to deliver better services or better wider benefit to society. But actually the overall benefits that we can have is by using the steel much more wisely. So historically steel has been very cheap and it's more beneficial to cut costs in labour, in time, in other aspects of the project and use more materials. And that's not just true for steel, that's true for everything. So rather than spending the time to optimise and using only just enough steel we need to deliver the purpose that we need to do, we use vastly more steel than we need. And that's the same with all materials. So
the example of the construction sector, embodied carbon in buildings is about double what it could be if you chose the best possible design for that building. And that would halve how much, not just steel, but also concrete and other materials that you're using. So generally, as a society, we can reduce the amount of steel that's required, even if in kind of small, isolated examples, the steel might increase in order to have that overall benefit of the system.
Thank you, Pippa. There are 2 questions in the Mentimeter tool to be asked, but we wish that if you could spend some of your time and answer these questions in the Mentimeter tool later on, so we can follow up on that then when we are all back in home. Thank you, Pippa, so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So we will move forward to our closing session. Juha Erkkilä from Outokumpu will be our final speaker. And 1 second. He will talk. Juha's presentation is about how to build successful steel business by using scrap. And he's going to present a business case. Juha Erkkilä is a metallurgist with a passion for sustainability. He's currently the head of sustainability at Outokumpu, which is the largest stainless steel producer in Europe. Juha has worked for 15 years in the steel industry, both in carbon steel side and stainless steel on 3 continents. Decarbonization is crucial in the steel industry, and increased circular economy and more rational consumption of steel are both required for successful transition. And what is most important, he will also tell more about the new circular economy initiative, which Outokumpu is going to present as fresh today. Floor is yours, Juha.
Thanks a lot, and it's a pleasure to be here today. And actually, it's now the second talk that I'm giving during this World Circular Economy Forum, and I will have to start it the same way as I started the first one. It was about minerals in the circular economy supply chain. I want to emphasize that we are not a mining company, we are a recycling company. We, in fact, use the most recycled material in the whole stainless steel industry globally. So that's where we stand in current terms, because Outokumpu is still seen in the Finnish society, especially as a mining company due to the legacy. We do believe, however, that there is a role of mining industry also to support the circular economy in order for it to function in the right kind of manner, which I will hope that I can demonstrate throughout this presentation, because we are still running 1 active mine at the moment, and that's the only chromium mine in the whole European Union in Kemi. So I think it has been established in the presentations today already that we have these 3 major trends that we are trying to tackle. Climate change needs to be addressed now, not in 27 years, because this decade is really a kind of a culmination point for the climate change to see that is it going to basically explode in our hands, melting the permafrost, releasing the methane into the atmosphere and so forth, or are we really able as a humanity to reduce our CO2 emissions? So I will actually steal the question that was addressed here earlier about what would be the one law or regulation that you would establish. It would be the universal carbon price that would automatically drive us all towards that direction. That's of course my opinion, but nevertheless that would be my answer. Then we have the whole urbanization. We have a huge amount of people coming into the world all the time. They are moving into the cities, which means more infrastructure is needed, and at the same time the GDP is growing, which is of course a positive problem, but it's a problem because it is creating more demand for materials. And that other question that I want to pick up, which was not a paid commercial by Outokumpu about the usage of stainless steel, but was a really good example of showcasing what we are really trying to aim at Outokumpu. It's about not making more stuff, but stuff that actually lasts. And that's what stainless steel is all about. We're looking at not, few years lifetimes. We are looking at decades, if not hundreds of years. So this picture summarizes quite neatly the whole business model of Outokumpu. We produce steel out of scrap. More than 90% of the input feed is scrap. Last year, 94%, and we are still rolling on the 94% level, which is industry leading. And we utilize 85% currently of all the side streams that are generated in the steel production. Then we make products that really last for a long time. Then you look at those bridges and buildings. These have extremely long lifespans. And you have to also look at the whole life cycle analysis when you are designing new stuff. Philippa had an excellent talk about the design aspects. So take a look at a carbon steel bridge. You will have to basically start a new paint job once the old paint job has already been finished. So basically you will accumulate these emissions throughout the lifespan of components unless it's designed for a longer utilization. Now, where does Outokumpu stand at the moment in the global context in stainless steel? Bear in mind that the previous talks about the usage of steel and the amount of emissions and such were about carbon steel. And carbon steel is roughly a 2 billion ton market on an annual basis. Out of that 2 billion ton, 50 to 60 million tons is the slice for stainless steel. So we're talking about 2 promille roughly from the global steel industry, so a small amount. But what is really staggering in the stainless steel industry is a point that was already raised earlier, is the role of ferroalloys. And if you have a spoon or fork in your hand at home and you wonder that why is this text saying 18-8? It's quite common. If you go home and you look at your kettles and pans and stuff, you will find it. I guarantee you. That means that that contains 18% of chromium and 8% nickel. So the alloying elements, even though they might sound like a modest quantity, they actually make up by far the biggest amount of the emissions when it comes to stainless steel production. And this is where we stand currently. So the Scope 3 emissions are by far the biggest, also in the case of Outokumpu. And this comparison is including the fact that we produce our own ferrochromium, which is the magical 18% in it in order to make the steel stainless. So that's why there is chromium in the steel, if you wonder. But I took a history lesson also here and looked back at what was Outokumpu's emissions 20 years ago. And the brutal fact was that our footprint back in beginning of 2000s was 7.0. And now we are at 1.7. So there has been quite good reduction. Yeah, you could say that, okay, we're quite happy with that, but of course we're not, because development stops in satisfaction, and that's why we have signed up for the SBTi and will reduce these even further. However, I also took a look at the reasons why we were at such numbers back in beginning of 2000s, and the fact was that at that point in time we were using roughly 50% recycled content. The rest was primary production. And this was the simple reason why we had really high carbon footprint. So now that we are at 94%, things look very different. Now that we have a substantial amount of low carbon electricity available, things look very different. But they can look much, much better even still. So this is where we are on our SBTi pathway. I'm looking forward, Rafal, to get that finalized, the 1.5, so that everyone else can join, because we are now the only steel company globally who has approved 1.5-degree targets. And since there isn't a SDA available for it, we have used a general approach in order to make these targets. But if you look at the whole SBTi as such, I mean, there is now 5,000 companies globally included in this initiative. So you can't call it an initiative. It's really a movement that has a massive momentum, and it has tens of trillions of dollars and euros in business behind it, supporting it throughout the value chain. So this should not fail if, unless all of these companies are not really doing what they're saying they will do. So there is a huge momentum which needs to be grasped at the moment in order to avoid the climate emergency that Philippa was talking about earlier. Then, where does our emissions hail from, and why do we want to talk about circular economy and how we could improve it even further? This is the brutal picture of where we are today, so divided into different scopes. Scope 1 emissions being the direct emissions from your own pipes, and Scope 2 the ones related to your energy, electricity, heat, and so forth. And then Scope 3, all of the emissions that are taking place outside of your own gates. And this is where we stand. So roughly, well, look at the amount of nickel, for instance. It's 38% out of the 2.7 million tons of CO2, meaning that it's actually higher than our direct emissions in total. And this is with the fact that more than 3/4 of the nickel units that we use are coming from recycled material. So only the 25% that is from primary, they are making that huge amount of emissions. So the answer to why did we now purchase a minor stake at the junior mine in Canada is quite obvious, because we want to reduce these Scope 3 related emissions. Because look at nickel as an example, the best producers in the world where this junior mine that I was talking about belongs to, the carbon footprint is roughly 2 tons of CO2 per ton of nickel. The worst ones are at 200 tons of CO2 per ton of nickel. This is 100 times difference. And you can imagine that what it would look like if we would go to that end of the spectrum rather than this end. Okay, I want to give you a global context here a little bit as to where do we stand on the recycling front on stainless steel industry. And it's particularly important because the value in stainless steel lies in the alloying elements. That is by far the biggest contributor to the total value of stainless steel. We have been developing our recycled content quite patiently. In 2013, we were at 80% level, and now we have kind of cumulatively been increasing it towards the last year, where we were at 94%, which we have maintained this year. And in the global context, the global average is at 44%. So you can tell that it's substantially above the average. And in Europe, all of the stainless steel production is basically based on scrap. So all is electric arc furnace based. And then in the developing countries, in China and Indonesia, we're talking about it's effectively a blast furnace process, even though it's done in a little bit different manner, because it's based on the so-called nickel pig iron that is behind all these quite high carbon dioxide values or intensities for the material. Now, we did an exercise about what could we do already today, because we have an emergency in our hands, to reduce the emissions even further in a drastical manner, so that we could clearly demonstrate that something can be done already today. And what came out was actually a very interesting new product called Outokumpu Circle Green. And there we were able to utilize our full-size production in order to meet an 0.5 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of steel. Now, okay, you might think that, well, still there's a lot of emissions, and I just saw a graph which was showing, that can be obtained in the carbon steel industry. True, in the carbon steel industry, that's the case, because they only talk about Scope 1 and 2 emissions. But this includes also the Scope 3 emissions. And why it is important? It's because when you make steel, you will always need lime, and lime will have a lot of emissions. You will always need the electrodes. Even making the electrodes will actually make a lot of emissions, actually more than the actual electrode usage itself. So all of these things are omitted in the steel decarbonization discussion when we are focusing on the Scope 1 and 2. But especially in stainless steel side, these are crucial things that has to be included in the total picture. So just looking at the detailed numbers, now why this 0.5 is actually a pretty impressive result. Look at the reduction on Scope 1 emissions. We were at 96% lower than what our standard normal production, so not any industry average or anything, is. And then on the Scope 2, 89%. And you can see the variance in the scale, so it actually summed up that Scope 1 and 2 emissions, they were reduced by 95% in total, which is something that people would already call a carbon neutral steel or what have you, if I'm looking at what is out there in the media. But we want to talk about the total picture, and that's why the scope 3 is included as well. And we can see that there is still room to improve. And now this is the linkage to the whole recycling picture. Because if we have better sorted scrap available, then we will be able to push this down even further, and we will be able to sustainably produce more and more material that I was just telling you about. By the way, during this exercise of producing the Circle Green, we also came up with, hey, we actually have a way of calculating our product carbon footprint online, basically for every single product that we produce. And we decided to implement it into our material test certificates so that customers know immediately what the CO2 burden was on their material. But now, to the very, very exciting part of the business case is I want to launch a new thing here. And this is to combine all the pieces together in the whole puzzle. So bear with me with a short video. All right. So welcome to the inner circle. I will steal a few minutes just to describe this in more detail, but what was discussed in the previous sessions was actually quite nicely segueing towards this, because we need this high-value recycling in order not to lose any metals that are dropped off on the way or getting blended in. Like a good example, what Tuomas was showing is the different types of austenitic stainless steel grades. Another grade, molybdenum, is an impurity, and in another one you need it. But then you don't really have means of separating it, so you are losing a whole ton of molybdenum. And guess what? Molybdenum has quite a high emission intensity. So if we are able to sort all these scraps much, much better in a more precise manner and in a more transparent and sustainable manner together with our customers, together with the scrap suppliers, then we are able to close the loop and offer more high-value recycling, which will enable more Circle Green production, which is the one that we want to be pushing to the market, because I want really our carbon footprint not to be 1.7 where we are, which is already the lowest in the industry, but I need it to be there at 0.5 or even lower than that, because that's the full aim. So what we are really launching here is that we want to strengthen the European circular economy across all dimensions, and we want to bring the full transparency. There was already a question here earlier about the social aspects of the supply chain. These are all coming in regulations like the CSDDD and so forth, but we really see the value on having a full visibility towards our customers on the supply chain, and this is a means to an end to get that happening. Then, of course, there is certain environmental benefits like making shorter logistical routes and ensuring that the scrap that is produced in the production of, say, a pan or fork or a tube or what have you, that all of those wastes that are coming in those processes are directly fed back into the production of new material in order not to get losses and dilutions. So, effectively, this picture summarizes the inner circle model. We want to close the loop for stainless steel and steel scrap in the supply chain. That's it. Sorry, I took a couple of minutes extra.
Thank you, Juha, and thank you particularly telling that one of the problems is that we don't have a universal carbon price yet at 2023. I was studying emission trading 1992, back in the last century, and I was hoping to have a universal carbon price. back in 1992. And then I became a portfolio emission trading portfolio manager at Rautaruukki, which was my dream job. But I could never have imagined that we don't have a universal carbon price 2023. So thank you for noticing that as well. Yes, there is a question.
Thank you very much. This was very inspiring, and congratulations, I mean, for all these. My one question is with the inner cycle. You mentioned that the inner circle, your goal is also better scrap recycling to better sort of keep the alloying elements basically in the loop, which is one important piece, but maybe the possibly even bigger piece would be talking to the OEMs, to the manufacturers, and back to the basics. This whole idea when stainless started was 3 or 4, there were, I don't know, a few ferritics, but more or less that was it. And now every manufacturer wants the perfect little alloy composition for the little product that gets never to economies of scale at recycling. Isn't that the much bigger problem?
I can only answer to that amen. I would really hope that as well, but it's a little bit like the chargers on cell phones, is that the OEMs tend to feel that if they have their own steel, they can particularly master all the processes. So that is, in fact, yes, definitely a consideration, that if we would have more back to basics product mixes, then this wouldn't be that much of an issue.
So I guess we have some Mentimeter questions. Oh, okay. So could we have the Menti slide on screen? The last one. Yes. So let's wrap up this session in this poll question. Please use your Mentimeter tool. Do you think more than 50% of steel will be made of scrap in 2050? Simple answer, yes or no. I love the pictures you have chosen here. Are we ready? So there is no one in this room who would not think like that. So we will have more than 50% of steel will be made of scrap in 2050, if I understand this right. So thanks. So I hope that you are interested to still continue networking discussions and mingling with us all ourselves. This room and the corridor over there will be here at our use until 3:45. So we have plenty of time to continue discussions. And we would be very happy if you could leave us your feedback by answering a poll or feedback survey that will be sent to you right after the event. And something about this organizer, WWF Finland. There's a lot of untapped potential in the cooperation between companies and civil society. So we would like to remind you that there's many good ways to cooperate and partnership together with the WWF. At the backbench here is Mrs. Annemi Usva-Vänttinen, who is the coordinator of partnerships with WWF and companies. So would you like to say a word, briefly, a word?
Yes, hello everybody. I will be very happy to continue discussing with you after this session and also in the future. So please contact us at the WWF. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we would like to thank you all our guest speakers. Here is Kirsi Vuorinen from WWF. Sorry. So thank you all for your very interesting presentations, new angles, new perspectives. So Kirsi is, yes.
Little Thanksgiving for you. Thank you so much.
So I hope most of you will stay and continue discussions. Thank you, World Wildlife Fund, for organizing this event. Oi.